Let's talk for a moment about the brush controls, the different aspects of using a brush, such as the stroke, such as the alpha, maybe a texture, things like that. Let's just get very clear on what controls what with brushes. First thing that we need to be aware of is that the primary feature of all brushes is their algorithm, the math behind the brush. So this is the math that defines the behavior of the standard brush. As the standard brush runs over the surface, the math of how it's going to push out along the normal and what's going to happen. Notice that the standard brush pulls out in one way, but then when we go over that stroke with another one, we're going to get some type of behavior. This is going to be different for each brush. Notice that we have a bit of a sharp point here, whereas this was softer. This is because as the brush rotates around, there's a bit of a snap as it changes direction. But watch what happens when we select the clay brush and do a very similar thing. Let's just pull one stroke out. First off, notice that the stroke is different. It's not in the same fashion as the other one. Now, let's just cross that. And we have a different behavior, although you still might notice a hit. Now, the algorithm for the clay brush requires that you use the depth feature to decide how much this brush is going to push and pull the surface. The standard brush has this built into it. It was only in 3.5 that this was taken out and actually made part of the interface. So as we increase the depth in bed, notice that our slider is increasing upwards, our circle I should say, and then also we're pushing farther outwards, and if we press Alt, pushing farther inwards. Now as we run along the surface, we're still going to get a nice clean addition. The form is being pushed and pulled in as clean a way as possible. And this is really the difference between the clay brush and the standard brush. Let's take a look at an example using a face. Now, I'm going to lower my resolution by pressing Shift D. Go back up a little. And this model is using subtools for the eyes, for the eyebrows, things like that. That's something that we're going to look at later. But for right now, what I want you to see is how the clay brush can be used to fill in an area like this eye area here. And as I run over the surface, the nature of the clay brush is going to be to create as smooth a surface as possible. And if we turn polyframe on, notice how the topology in some places has just gone completely crazy. But clay brush has adjusted the topology, moved it around so that it will get a clean surface. This is in contrast to the standard brush. And if I'm going to fill in an area with a standard brush, it's going to be much harder to get a nice clean plane. And instead, as I build on the surface, I'm going to start to get a bunch of lumpy areas that I would then have to press Shift to smooth down, lower my resolution, Shift and smooth those down, and just kind of melt them back into place. The clay brush is designed to kind of handle topology and create a clean, planar surface with minimal fuss. Nice, clean, planar surface. But the difference between these two brushes is really handled in their algorithm. Some features, some parts of that algorithm are available out in the interface, such as depth, and then others are not and cannot be changed. Now, if you open up the brush palette and just hover over one of the brushes, notice that in the icon down in the bottom, it says clay buildup, base type equals clay. Base type equals pump for the blob brush. So this shows you that the clay brush is a root brush, whereas clay buildup is a derivative, a variation, all the way to clay tubes. And since I made rake, I'm also aware that rake is clay. Ram, on the other hand, is single layer. So these are all brushes with some variation. So ram, the only difference between rake and the clay brush is really that alpha. And it's a very simple modification, but that one alpha allows me to come in and cut away an area in a way that kind of mimics a rake. Now if we come in and check out a few other brushes like /1, /2, these are just using the standard brush, but then they're making some modifications in the alpha palette to get this kind of alpha. The modification is happening here in the alpha adjust. If we reset that, it goes back to normal. If we set our mid value and our radial fade, we see the alpha itself. So some behavior comes from brush settings, some behavior comes from alphas. By adjusting things in the brush palette and in the alpha palette, we can get a lot of control over the behavior of our brush. But we can get even more control by adjusting things in the stroke palette. So for example, we can come into, say, the blob brush. We can select an alpha, like let's say alpha 24, 25, and then as we brush along the surface, we're getting this kind of strange alien intestinal kind of shape, which I'm sure has its purposes and would definitely be great for creating an alien landscape. But as soon as we come in and turn spray stroke on, we get a very different behavior. If we press Alt, let go of Alt, the behavior of the blob brush is pretty much the same. It kind of ignores these a little bit. Its main function is to kind of perturb the surface. Let's just take a look at polyframe and see what happens. Notice how it's creating these really organic, minute type effects. But overall, it isn't really perturbing, it isn't really distorting the geometry. So that's actually the behavior, the algorithm of the blob brush is to adjust and add these kind of minute, just tiny details, but relax the topology over the surface of that. So we can quickly kind of build up some kind of moon crater. Let's go in with the clay tubes brush. And clay tubes is a brush created to really help you build form up in a really natural way and leave these strokes behind so that your model can start to look almost sculpted. Now if we come in to the stroke and turn spray on, the behavior changes and this becomes a really cool way to quickly build up, let's say, a cliff wall. Relax this a little bit by smoothing, and then we can get in here and start to adjust and work the surface. So as you're working with brushes, keep in mind that the brush type is important. Work with your alpha to change that shape of the brush, and then work with the stroke to just change the behavior of the stroke, the brush as it sweeps across the surface. Now let's take a quick look at some of the stroke modifiers. Let's take the stroke palette and I'm going to click the swatch to send it over to the tray. And the spray stroke has two settings here that, well, 3, 4 that really aren't available with the other strokes. Let's just go into dots. See, they go away. Dots, you've just got these guys down along the bottom. But spray stroke, So what is it that these features do? Color variation we're going to look at when we get into texturing. That's where that's really important. But placement and flow define how many of these alphas are just kind of scattered onto the surface. Notice that as I take placement down and flow down, you almost lose the effect of spray. Let's take flow all the way up, and we're just getting a lot of density. So placement is going to be really important for how spread out these are. Wider area. Flow is going to help to define how many of those dots are going to be basically sprayed onto the surface within placement's range. So I've lowered flow really far, and we're just getting a diffuse kind of spray about that. Now if I increase flow, we're just getting tons of them. Take flow all the way up, and you've got instant density. So you can adjust these to keep this to be a light effect, or just to go heavy-handed with it. Now if we take a look at the dot stroke, we can start to understand what roll and roll distance do. Let's just load another project. I'm going to turn the floor off. And let's turn polyframe on to see how many polys we have. 16,000. I'm going to press Control D and divide that one more time. Okay, so let's go to the standard brush, and we're going to turn symmetry off and just make one stroke along the top. Now let's add an alpha into that mix. Let's say alpha 33. So now the alpha is actually being dragged across the surface. Let's select a tileable alpha like alpha 62. Again, just dragging that through the surface. If we wanted to actually stamp that down, we need to turn roll on. And by turning roll on, your tileable alpha is just going to roll along the surface. You have to be careful about things in the front. Notice, see that swirling that's happening? And this is one of the problems with roll, is that the swirling can get in and really destroy trying to match these up. That can be controlled in the brush palette to some extent by going to samples and say stabilize orientation and stabilize direction. Let's set that all the way to 100. We're still getting it. But as I go back and forth, it's not really changing too much. Let's turn this all the way off. Now as I go back and forth, left, right, up, down, notice that it really makes a mess out of the surface. But again, turning stabilized direction on, while it didn't really address what happened at the beginning, it does allow me to move left and right, up and down, without really destroying or muddying up the geometry. So stabilized direction is helping me keep the vector of that stroke intact as much as possible. So roll is important to get that on there. Let's just make sure that's all the way off. Now watch what happens as we increase roll distance. Notice the stretching that's happening. Let's decrease roll distance. Notice how it's compacting upon itself. Let's set our color to white and use a matte cap gray. Roll distance is a new feature with ZBrush 4 that allows you to stretch or compact the rolling of the stroke. So this lets you do a couple of really cool things. Let's take a look at the new weave brushes. Notice that their base type is clay. But if you come over here they have roll on, roll distance is on, and they're using kind of an unexpected alpha. Let's just drag that all the way across, and they've got a really cool effect. Let's take weave 2, more dense alpha, and so this is for fabric texturing. The idea being able to kind of capture some of that tertiary texturing really quickly. Roll distance is really key to that. Select weave 3, and we've changed our alpha, but we're still using the same roll distance feature. So now this is a totally different behavior. And its brush type is still clay. This alpha gets a lot of use in a lot of brushes. Skin is one of them that uses an alpha. Just like that. And if you run the brush up and down, around in circles, you can get some really nice skin behavior. Increase our resolution so we can see that better. And there you go. Now, skin is using the standard brush as its type. It's using dot stroke. But what's really important to skin is depth. What depth is doing in this case, being set to -74, is forcing the effect down into the surface so that you only get the effect of this brush a little bit. That means that it's not really going to perturb the surface, it's just going to put this secondary detail on, this tertiary detail. So let's select something that's got a bit of a cavity to it. Looks like matcap is our best. And let's take the brush depth and just set that back up to 0. Notice that as I brush on the surface now, it's going to more quickly kind of perturb the surface and pull straight up. Now that's something that skin was not going to do when embed was set at a lower value of about -74. So all of these features can combine to create some really awesome tools for you. But whatever you do, make sure that you come in and check out the brushes that ship with ZBrush but are not in the interface. So I've selected 4 rows. There's a ton of them in here. A good one to see some really interesting power to these brushes is Scales Lizard. Notice the alpha. And then if we come into the alpha palette, there is one feature that is creating a bit of a gradient around that, and that's RF, radial fade. If I set that to 0, then that fade goes away. Set that back up to 16, and it's going to soften the effect. Blur is also on, so that's taking what was a hard alpha and really blurring that quite a bit. Now, if we come in, notice that this is using lazy mouse for its effect, which is something that all the scale brushes are really using. couple of things to note about lazy mouse. Keep an eye on lazy step and lazy radius. We'll look at those in a little bit.